Good morning. Happy Monday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right, we are back. This is relatively live. We vacated the premises for about a week. We were hiding up in the mountains somewhere. Very little Wi-Fi access, which is probably a good thing to unplug for a little bit. Got a lot of thinking done. So it was great. Quick reminder, those of you who are iFast University members, we have a 1 p.m. Q&A call, you and I together. It will be great as usual. So if you're not signed up for iFast U, I suggest you do that. You can do it very, very quickly, and then we'll see you at 1 p.m. Okay, so let's dig in to Monday's Q&A. This comes from Josh, and Josh says, "Hi, Bill." Hi, Josh. And he says, "Can you describe the sequence you use when attempting to improve a wide ISA with limited internal rotation and external rotation measures of the shoulder and the hip? Do you go after internal rotation first, or do you try to improve external rotation at the 0 to 60 degree range first, then internal rotation, then external rotation at the higher ranges?" Thank you. Josh, I really like your thinking here. And I think you're kind of on point, but let's go ahead and talk our way through this so we really have some logic and some understanding as to the how and whys of how we're going to address this. So first things first, let's talk about how we got here in the first place. So we're going to break out the skeleton here a little bit. My skeleton just happens to have this beautiful wide ISA, right? And if we turn him sideways, you can see that he's actually kind of compressed too, which is kind of cool when you think about it, that I didn't even ask for this and this is what I got. So when we're talking about the wide ISA and they've lost internal and external rotation, what we've had is a series of compressive strategies that allow us to manage our center of gravity on two legs. But what ultimately results in this is as we compress, we're going to lose our ability to move the scapula. We're going to increase the concentric orientation of superficial musculature. And then ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to lose our internal and external rotations. The same thing is happening in the pelvis as it is in the thorax. And so we're going to lose hip range of motion and shoulder range of motion. Under certain circumstances, this is totally expected. It's associated with training, high force production. So very, very strong individuals may demonstrate this and be perfectly fine and perfectly happy. Under other circumstances, this might cause discomfort, pain, and progressive degeneration of structure. And so again, in some cases we like it, in some cases we don't. We just have to turn this into a management process. Now, the thing we want to keep in mind is as we move through this, as we compress and we start to lose rotations, our wide ISA biases towards internal rotation, and so as we compress, we're going to be biased more and more towards that, and then so our external rotation strategy then becomes an orientation. So what happens over time is we compress, move towards IR, we lose ER, and then we turn our external rotation strategy into orientation. We turn the sockets into external rotation. So we change the shape of the ilium, we change the shape of the thorax, and we start turning our sockets outward, so eventually they point straight out to the sides. And then what ultimately happens is we lose our gradient within the joint. So we have a fluid gradient that allows us to move through space, and we will eventually lose that. So if there's no gradient, there's no movement. So again, very, very useful if my goal is high levels of force production, like say a power lifter or something like that, where I'm willing to give up range of motion for higher force production and, for lack of a better term, greater stability. But ultimately, it becomes so stable that it just doesn't move well. So our first goal here, Josh, is to restore a gradient, first and foremost, whether we're talking about internal or external rotation. Now, let me throw a few perspectives at you that may be helpful. So if we think about the evolutionary order of things, back when we were swimmers and before we evolved onto land creatures, we were very biased towards external rotation. So if you watch a frog swim in the water, they're very, very biased towards external rotation. Their propulsion is towards IR, but they're still very, very biased towards ER. So as we walk out of the water and we become land-based creatures, we have to internally rotate to be able to propel against gravity and maintain our position against gravity. So from an evolutionary perspective, what we want to do is we want to chase external rotation first. It came first. It's easier for us to recapture. There is a predominance of external rotation in movement versus internal rotation when we think about the grand scale of things as well. Now, from an embryological standpoint, you personally evolved in your mother's womb in external rotation, and then you gained internal rotation later on. And so if we think about evolution, we think about embryology, right away we got to say, okay, ER bias is what we're going to chase first. Now, from a logical standpoint, what we're going to have is we're going to have limitations in internal and external rotation under these circumstances because of the loss of gradient. But we're probably going to have some range of external rotation that's going to be available to us, assuming that we're still capable of moving through space to some degree. And so these are going to be our lower ranges of what we would consider traditional flexion. So as you stated, that 0 to 60 kind of a range is where we're going to have to start to work. And so it stands to reason, if that's the range that we have available to us, this is what we're going to try to access, and then we're going to try to regain some expansion under those circumstances. So that's going to be an ER bias as well. So, step one, as we go through this process, eliminate interference. So anything that reinforces the compressive strategy is going to become interference for us when we're trying to recapture the segmental movement that you're speaking of. So things like, what they would classify this as horizontal pressing are probably going to be interference. Anything that's a high force output that requires that I use a breath hold is going to be interference because it's reinforcing our compressive strategy. And again, if we're trying to restore gradients, we just can't have that. So again, we're going to move towards that lower end of external rotation. Now, to capture more of that external rotation, or to move us towards the internal rotation capabilities, which is further up the chain, so to speak, in regards to the range of motion, we may have to get you off your feet, because what we have to do is we have to gain eccentric orientation of musculature that's interfering with our ability to move. To do that, we have to reduce the forces. So sometimes we actually have to reduce the force of gravity to do that. And so we take you off your feet. That reduces the internal forces that we produce ourselves, and it reduces the external forces that are associated with gravity. So under those circumstances, side lying activities, gentle rolling activities are great ways to start to reshape the thorax and the pelvis, as well as just taking advantage of the change of the direction of gravity to promote that anterior posterior expansion that we need to gain eccentric orientation and start to recapture some of these ranges of motion and allow us to reorient the scapula and the innominate. I would point you towards certain videos that would promote this anterior posterior expansion, especially dorsal rostral and posterior expansion. So the dorsal rostral expansion videos on YouTube. There's a better band pull apart, and I actually think I have one on endgame wide ISA strategy, so I would check those out. As far as training goes, you're going to want to use short staggered stances, because again, we can't go into the deeper elements of flexion, because we're just going to dive right into some form of compensatory strategy that we probably don't want to reinforce. So again, staggered stance. There's some arm training videos that I have posted that will show useful stances and useful positions of the upper extremities. So then, as you gain hip and shoulder range of motion, and so we can approach this 90-degree of traditional shoulder flexion, now we can start to reinforce with reaching activities, pushing and pulling activities, half kneeling strategies and such. I posted a half kneeling breakdown last week. You might want to check that one out, because it's going to reinforce some of the concepts that we're talking about here when we're talking about what you see in certain orientations in half kneeling. The one thing that I would stress to you, Josh, if your goal is to recapture ranges of motion, then you got to make sure that you got to breathe through these activities, because the minute you start associating a breath hold or using any form of forced exhalation strategy during these activities, you're just reinforcing the compressive strategy. You're not going to recapture your gradients, and you're not going to recapture your internal and external rotations. So I hope that leads you in a certain direction that is useful. Again, check out the videos on YouTube. That's you guys. I will see you later this afternoon. Everybody have a great Monday, and I'll see you tomorrow.